She was ranked #1 last year. This year, she's not even in the top 4. And the reason will change the way you look at the whole league. Before you scroll past this, I need you to know something. What you're about to hear is not just a story about a basketball ranking. It is a story about a hidden system that almost nobody outside the league understands. A system that decided, on purpose, that the most popular player in the sport did not deserve the #1 spot. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why it happened, who made that decision possible, and what it really means for the future of women's basketball. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the stranger this story gets. June 17th was supposed to be just another Tuesday for the WNBA. The league dropped its first All-Star voting returns. Fans checked the list, a few sports shows made some quick jokes, and everybody figured the conversation would die down by lunchtime. Instead, one single number blew the entire thing wide open. Caitlin Clark was sitting in 5th place. Not first, not second, not even 4th. 5th. Now, under normal circumstances, 5th place in a league full of elite athletes would be considered a huge achievement. But Caitlin Clark isn't a normal case, and you already know that. She is the player who has completely taken over the conversation around women's basketball. She fills arenas that used to sit half empty. She breaks television ratings records almost every time she steps on the court. She moves more merchandise than anyone else in the league, by a wide margin. People who love her watch. People who can't stand her also watch. Either way, she has become impossible to ignore. And that kind of pull is something almost no athlete in any sport ever reaches. So when her name showed up in 5th place, the entire basketball world stopped scrolling. Social media absolutely exploded. Theories, arguments, screenshots, hot takes, all of it within minutes. But here's the part that really got people fired up. They weren't just asking why she wasn't first. They were asking how this was even possible in the first place. If she's the most talked about player in the sport, how does she end up behind 4 other names in a vote that's supposed to measure exactly that? How does someone who is breaking attendance records and shattering ratings somehow look up at a leaderboard instead of sitting on top of it? And listen, this part is important, so don't skip ahead, because the answer to that question is sitting right in the middle of this video. And once you hear it, you will never look at All-Star voting the same way again. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel breaks down the stories the league doesn't want you connecting the dots on. And trust me, this one is just getting started. The comparison that made everything worse. Here's what made this even more confusing. Just 12 months earlier, Caitlin Clark wasn't fighting for a spot near the top of the voting. She was running away with it. Her name led the pack comfortably. The gap between her numbers and almost everyone else reflected exactly what you'd expect from a player who had just walked into the league and flipped the entire business model on its head overnight. Fast forward one single year, and suddenly that same player is sitting several spots lower. To a lot of fans, that simply didn't add up. If anything, her profile had only gotten bigger. Her games had become even bigger events. Her name was bigger in headlines than it had ever been. So how does a player who looks more popular than ever somehow score lower in a popularity vote? That question is exactly where this story stops being about basketball and starts being about something much bigger, a system most fans never even knew existed. And once you understand that system, I promise you, the 5th place ranking is going to make a disturbing amount of sense. But before we get into that, here's something you need to sit with for a second, because it's going to come back later in this video in a way you won't expect. There is one detail buried inside these voting results that fans only noticed days later, and when they did, it completely changed the conversation. I'll get to that, Keep watching. For a moment, just sit with how strange this actually is. Imagine any other industry where the most visible, most discussed, most profitable name in the entire business somehow shows up fifth on a list measuring exactly that kind of visibility. It would make headlines everywhere, not just in sports. People would assume something behind the scenes had shifted because in almost every other case, that kind of mismatch doesn't happen by accident. That's exactly the instinct fans had here. Not blind outrage, not just fan loyalty talking, a genuine, reasonable confusion, because the numbers on paper and the reality on television screens told two completely different stories. And whenever that gap shows up, in any industry, the real explanation is almost never simple. It usually means there's a structure underneath the surface that most people never bothered to look at. That structure is exactly what we're about to dig into. The shock of the first returns. When the first voting returns dropped, almost everyone expected the same familiar name to be sitting comfortably at number 1. This is Caitlin Clark we're talking about, the player whose arrival turned the WNBA into one of the most discussed sports stories in the entire country. The player whose games draw crowds that some leagues would kill for. The player whose highlights are all over social media before the final buzzer even sounds. For months, every conversation about the league circled back to her. That's exactly why this ranking felt like such a gut punch to so many fans. They opened the results expecting confirmation of what they already believed, and instead they got a twist nobody saw coming. She wasn't first. She wasn't second. She wasn't third. She wasn't even fourth. Her name landed in 5th place, behind several players who are absolutely talented, absolutely accomplished, but who simply do not move the needle on public attention the way she does. And that disconnect is what made people furious. Because everywhere you look, the evidence of her influence is impossible to miss. Road arenas sell out the second her team's schedule drops. Networks build entire broadcast windows around her games. Opposing teams openly admit the attention spike whenever the Fever roll into town. So when the official voting numbers came out looking completely different from that reality, people felt like something didn't line up. And it wasn't just the ranking, it was who was sitting ahead of her. The teammate twist. Here's the detail I told you to remember. Sitting ahead of Caitlin Clark in these early returns was someone you would never expect, her own teammate. The second fans noticed this, the entire conversation shifted into a completely different gear. Because nobody is questioning this teammate's talent. She's a Rookie of the Year, a foundational piece of the franchise, respected inside locker rooms across the entire league. That was never the issue. The issue was what it symbolized. For the better part of 2 years, the Indiana Fever's national story has revolved almost entirely around one face. So when fans scrolled through the rankings and saw a teammate sitting above her, it didn't feel like a basketball story anymore. It felt like a signal that something behind the scenes was working very differently than fans assumed. Screenshots spread everywhere within hours. Some people said it proved the vote rewarded respect inside the game over popularity outside of it. Others said it proved the entire system was disconnected from what fans actually wanted to see. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. If the most visible player in the sport could fall behind her own teammate, then maybe raw popularity wasn't driving this vote at all. And that single realization is what sent fans digging into something most of them never thought to question before: how this vote actually works behind the curtain. Stick around, because what they found completely rewired how people think about every All-Star vote going forward. This next part is the real twist of the entire story. The numbers that didn't add up. Before we get to the system itself, let's talk about the raw numbers, because this is where things get even stranger. Last year, Caitlin Clark didn't just lead the voting, she dominated it. Her vote total towered over the rest of the field, well north of 500,000 votes in the very first returns. It was a number that reflected exactly what you'd expect from a player who had just shaken the entire league awake. This year, that number dropped significantly. For a lot of fans, that one fact raised an immediate red flag. How does the most visible athlete in the sport pull in dramatically fewer votes during a season when her profile is supposedly even bigger than before? Normally, a drop like that signals fading interest, declining relevance, a star cooling off. But none of that lines up with what was actually happening around the league. Television numbers were still spiking every time she played. Road games were still selling out. Her highlights were still dominating every sports feed on the planet. This is not the profile of an athlete losing attention. This is the profile of an athlete who somehow has more eyes on her than ever, yet fewer votes behind her. Some people pointed to overall lower voter turnout across the league this year as an explanation, and that's a fair point worth mentioning. But here's the problem with that theory. If everybody's numbers drop at roughly the same rate, the order at the top usually stays the same. The biggest names typically stay on top. In this case, the entire hierarchy shifted. And that's the detail that kept this story alive online for days, instead of disappearing after 24 hours like most viral sports debates do. So if it's not a popularity collapse, and it's not simply lower turnout, then what is it? This is where the story stops being about Caitlin Clark and starts being about a formula almost nobody outside the league office had ever actually read before. And once you hear how this formula works, you are going to understand exactly why this result was never an accident. Keep watching, because this next part is the actual core of the entire mystery. The formula nobody talks about. For years, most casual fans assumed all-star voting worked exactly the way it sounds. Fans vote, the player with the most votes wins. Simple as that. That assumption felt obvious. It felt fair. And it was completely wrong. Here is the part that shocked thousands of people the moment they learned it. Fan voting only accounts for 50% of the final result. The other 50% is split between two groups that almost no casual fan ever thinks about when they're tapping that vote button on their phone. 25% comes from current players across the league. Another 25% comes from a panel of selected media members. Read that again. 3 completely separate groups, each casting their own evaluation, all blended together into one final number. Not one popularity contest. 3 different contests happening at the same time with 3 completely different sets of values. Fans tend to reward excitement, big moments, emotional connection. The kind of highlight that makes you grab your phone and send it to 10 people. Players, on the other hand, often weight things like on-court performance, defensive effort, and the kind of respect that only gets earned by playing against someone night after night. Media members frequently lean towards stats, team success, and season-long consistency. None of those approaches are wrong. They're just different lenses looking at the same player. And for Caitlin Clark specifically, that difference matters more than it would for almost anyone else in the league, because no other player in the WNBA has a gap this large between how the public sees her and how the league's insiders evaluate her. Most stars score fairly evenly across all 3 voting groups. Her numbers don't. And that gap is exactly what produced a 5th-place finish for the player every casual fan assumed would walk away with number 1. This is not a broken system making a mistake. This is a system doing exactly the job it was built to do. Which, honestly, might be even more unsettling once you really sit with it. Think about what that actually means for a second. It means every single year, this exact scenario could repeat itself. A player can dominate ticket sales, dominate television ratings, dominate social media, dominate merchandise, and still walk away from the official vote looking like she's somehow less important than players generating a fraction of that attention. Not because anyone cheated, not because anyone manipulated anything, but because the formula was never designed to measure pure popularity in the first place. It was designed to measure something closer to consensus. Fans, players, and media all agreeing together on who deserves the spotlight. The problem is, nobody ever explained that clearly to the millions of casual fans who assumed they were simply voting in a popularity contest. And that disconnect between what people thought they were doing and what the system was actually built to do is the real story hiding underneath all of this. If you're starting to see how deep this actually goes, drop a comment with just the word system so I know you're still here. Because what comes next connects this entire formula back to something that happened in a completely different sport years ago, and it's going to make this whole situation click into place. But here's the question that really matters, and I promise you this is where it gets personal. Why would a league intentionally build a system that could bury its biggest star behind players with smaller audiences? What's the actual reasoning? Stay with me, because that answer says more about the future of this league than the ranking itself ever could. A player bigger than the system built to measure her. To really understand why this controversy hit as hard as it did, you have to understand something most fans overlook. This isn't really a story about an all-star vote. It's a story about what happens when one single athlete becomes bigger than the entire framework designed to evaluate her. Most stars build their fame slowly. Years of winning, years of highlights, years of building a fan base one season at a time. Caitlin Clark skipped that timeline completely. The moment she stepped onto a WNBA court, she brought an audience that had already been building for years in college basketball. She didn't join the league. She imported millions of new eyes directly into it. That creates a strange dynamic. For a huge number of fans, she isn't just one player among many. She's the reason they started watching at all. She's their entry point into the sport. That doesn't automatically make her the best player on the floor, but it does make her relationship with the audience completely different from anyone else wearing a jersey. And with that kind of attention comes something just as powerful: polarization. People who love her intensely. People who push back against the hype push back hard. Either way, she generates reaction. And in modern sports, reaction is currency. Nobody else in this league generates anywhere near the same volume of conversation, good or bad. So when a voting system built on three very different value systems gets applied to a player this unique, the cracks are going to show up faster and more visibly than they would for literally anyone else on the roster. A player with a smaller profile might never expose this gap at all. She does because the spotlight on her is simply too large to hide anything. Think about it like this. If a role player who barely gets national TV coverage ranked 5th among guards, nobody would notice, nobody would care, nobody would post a single screenshot about it. The vote totals for players outside the spotlight are simply too small for any gap between fan opinion and insider opinion to ever become visible. But put a player at the absolute center of the league's growth into that same formula, and suddenly every inch of daylight between how fans see her and how insiders evaluate her becomes a national conversation. That's not a flaw exclusive to Caitlin Clark. That's simply what happens anytime someone this large gets run through a system built for averages. The bigger the star, the bigger the magnifying glass on every imperfection in how she's measured. And that brings us to the real question sitting underneath this entire controversy. One that has nothing to do with vote totals and everything to do with where this league is actually headed. Two kinds of fame colliding in real time. Before we get to where this league is headed, you need to understand something most fans completely miss, because it's the actual engine driving this entire controversy. There are two completely different kinds of influence at play here, and they almost never get measured the same way. The first kind is public influence. This is the loud, visible, impossible to miss kind of fame. Sold-out road arenas, record-breaking television audiences, jerseys flying off shelves, trending hashtags after every single game. This kind of influence is easy to see because it shows up in numbers companies actually report. Ticket sales, viewership, merchandise revenue. It's measurable, it's enormous, and right now, nobody in this league generates more of it than Caitlin Clark. The second kind is insider influence. This one is quieter, and it lives almost entirely inside the sport itself. It's built through years of head-to-head competition. It's built through how hard you play defense against someone who's trying to beat you. It's built through respect earned in practice gyms and locker rooms that the public never sees. Veteran players, coaches, and longtime league insiders tend to measure greatness through this lens, and it doesn't always move at the same speed as public hype. Here's the part that explains almost everything we've talked about so far. These two forms of influence do not automatically rise and fall together. A player can dominate one completely while still building the other. That's not a scandal. That's not bias. That's just how respect inside a competitive sport tends to work. It's earned slowly, game by game, season by season, often regardless of how loud the outside noise gets. For most athletes, this distinction never becomes a story because their public profile and their insider profile sit relatively close together. Nobody notices a gap that barely exists. But for a player whose public profile exploded almost overnight, the gap between those two worlds becomes impossible to hide. The public side sprinted ahead in a matter of months. The insider side is still moving at the pace it always has, methodically, game by game, deserved respect compounding slowly over time. That's not a flaw in her game. That's simply what happens when one form of fame grows 10 times faster than the other. And once you see the gap that way, the fifth-place ranking stops looking like an insult and starts looking like a snapshot, a frozen moment showing exactly where these two different timelines currently intersect. The public timeline says she's already the face of the league. The insider timeline says that recognition is still catching up, one season at a time. Whether that feels fair to you probably depends on which version of fame you personally think matters more. And that disagreement, right there, is the exact reason this story refuses to die down. The league's identity crisis. Strip away the percentages, strip away the formula, strip away the screenshots flying around social media, and you're left with one real question. What does the WNBA actually want to be right now, at the exact moment it's experiencing the biggest growth spurt in its history? Television numbers are up, national attention is up, corporate partnerships are expanding at a pace nobody predicted even 3 years ago. A lot of that growth traces directly back to one player walking through the door and bringing a brand new audience with her. From a pure business standpoint, leaning all the way into that kind of star power seems obvious. Other leagues have done exactly that for decades. But here's where it gets complicated for women's basketball specifically, instead of full, unified agreement on how hard to push that spotlight. The conversation keeps splitting into debate. Some fans believe she isn't being promoted at the level her actual influence deserves. Others argue she already receives more attention than anyone else in the sport, full stop. There's also been a lot of online chatter. And I want to be completely clear here. Most of this is speculation from fans, not confirmed reporting, about whether her rise has created any tension behind the scenes. Some people insist there's resentment toward the spotlight she pulls in. Others say that narrative is wildly overblown. Nobody outside that locker room actually knows for certain, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing. What we do know for certain is this: her presence has triggered a debate inside this league unlike anything the WNBA has dealt with before. And weirdly enough, both sides of that debate actually want the exact same outcome: bigger audiences, bigger contracts, a bigger future for the sport. They just disagree completely on how to get there. This fifth-place ranking didn't create that tension. It simply made it visible for the entire internet to see at once. Look at this from the league's perspective for a moment, because that's the part most fans never stop to consider. A league office isn't just thinking about one season. They're thinking about the next decade. They're thinking about the players who built this league before national television ever cared. They're thinking about the next generation of stars who will enter the league after this current wave of attention eventually settles. If every single decision tilts entirely toward whoever happens to be the biggest individual draw in any given year, what happens to the players who built the foundation everyone else is now standing on? What happens to the next young star 10 years from now who deserves a fair shot at being seen too? That's the tightrope. Lean too hard into one player and you risk the league looking like a one-woman show that fades the moment she's no longer the center of attention. Lean too hard away from her and you risk alienating the exact audience that just discovered this league exists. Neither extreme is sustainable, and that's precisely why this voting formula was built to pull from 3 different rooms instead of just one. And if you think this is the first time a major professional league has run face first into this exact problem, you're wrong. Because there's another league, years ago, that hit this exact same wall, and the way they solved it might explain exactly why the WNBA's voting system is built the way it is right now. The story isn't over. Here's the truth nobody wants to admit while they're busy arguing about percentages online. This 5th-place ranking isn't really about Caitlin Clark at all. It's about a league standing at a crossroads, trying to figure out how to honor a system built on competition and respect, while also protecting the single biggest commercial engine the sport has ever had. Both things matter. Both things are valid. And right now, this league hasn't fully decided how to balance them. And that uncertainty is exactly what you're watching play out in real time, one voting cycle at a time. So here's my question for you, and I actually want you to answer this in the comments before you go anywhere. Do you think the WNBA should change this voting formula to weigh fan popularity more heavily? Or do you think keeping player and media input in the mix is what protects the integrity of the game long term? Drop your take below, because I read every single one of them. And if this breakdown actually helped the whole story click for you, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications. Because this situation is nowhere near finished. More voting checkpoints are coming before the final rosters are locked in. And when the next twist drops, you are going to want to be here for it first. I'll see you in the next one.